Nick Drake did not die on a stage. There were no flashing lights, no applause, no final performance, no farewell tour. He died quietly, in the same bedroom where he had once learned to play the guitar, in a house so still that no one heard anything wrong until it was already too late. When his parents found him that morning, there was no note. No dramatic explanation. Only an empty silence, a bottle of prescribed pills, and a question that has lingered for more than 50 years, what really happened during Nick Drake's final hours? To the world, Nick Drake was a name that barely registered in 1974. His albums had sold poorly. His voice had almost disappeared from public life. And yet, decades later, his music would come to define an entire generation's understanding of melancholy, fragility, and quiet beauty. So how did a musician who seemed to vanish while still alive end his life in such complete isolation? Was his death a tragic accident, the result of medication and exhaustion? Or was it the final, silent decision of a man who had been slowly withdrawing from the world for years? In this story, we will slow time down. We will return to the weeks and days leading up to that night. We will examine the room, the silence, the medications, and the emotional state no one quite knew how to read. And by retracing Nick Drake's final hours, we will try to understand not just how he died, but how someone so gifted, so sensitive, could fade away without the world noticing until it was already over. The news of Nick Drake's death did not arrive with headlines or breaking alerts. There were no crowds gathering outside a hospital. No emergency press conferences. No stunned industry insiders scrambling for answers. In late November 1974, his passing moved quietly through a narrow circle of family, friends, and a handful of people in the British music industry who already feared this moment had been coming. For most of the public, it barely registered at all. A short notice. A line in a paper. A name that, to many, meant very little at the time. That contrast is impossible to ignore now. Because today, Nick Drake is regarded as one of the most influential singer-songwriters of the 20th century. His music is studied, covered, rediscovered, and revered. His voice is described as timeless. His lyrics are quoted as if they were private confessions meant for each listener alone. But in the days immediately following his death, there was no sense that the world had lost something irreplaceable. For those closest to him, the shock was quieter, heavier, and deeply personal. His parents, who had watched their son retreat further into himself over the previous years, were left to process not only the loss, but the unanswered questions. There was no explanation attached to his final moments. No clarity that might offer comfort. Only the knowledge that he had been struggling, and that somehow, despite medical care, family presence, and attempts at protection, the struggle had ended this way. Within the small community of musicians and producers who had worked with Nick, the reaction was one of subdued devastation. Many had already seen his withdrawal as alarming. Recording sessions had become increasingly difficult. Live performances had stopped entirely. Conversations with him were often brief, distant, or impossible to sustain. His death felt less like a sudden tragedy, and more like the final chapter of a story that had been slipping quietly toward darkness for years. Yet even among those who knew him well, there was disagreement. Some believed his death was an accident, a terrible miscalculation involving prescription medication and a fragile mental state. Others suspected something more deliberate, pointing to the depth of his depression and the long pattern of isolation that preceded that night. The absence of a definitive answer ensured that the debate would never truly settle. And outside that circle, the world moved on. There were no retrospectives. No tributes. No urgent attempts to re-examine his work. It would take years, decades, even, for Nick Drake's music to be rediscovered and understood for what it was. When that happened, the question of his death would resurface with renewed intensity. Listeners would hear his songs differently, reading his lyrics as foreshadowing, as warnings, as fragments of a goodbye no one recognized at the time. In hindsight, his death would come to symbolize something larger: how easily a sensitive artist can disappear in plain sight, how success and recognition often arrive too late, and how silence can be just as dangerous as chaos. But to understand how Nick Drake reached that final night, the silence, the pills, and the unanswered questions, we have to go back, far before the final hours, to the life that slowly led him there. Nick Drake was born into comfort, but not into ease. He grew up in a quiet English household where music was present, encouraged, and deeply personal. His mother wrote songs of her own, often recording them privately, never for public release. Music, in this house, was not about performance or applause. It was something inward. Something intimate. Something that existed safely behind closed doors. From an early age, Nick showed a sensitivity that set him apart. He was intelligent, observant, and reserved. At school, he did not fight for attention. He watched. He absorbed. And when he discovered the guitar, it became less an instrument than a refuge, a way to express thoughts that never seemed to translate easily into conversation. By his late teens, it was clear that Nick Drake was unusually gifted. His fingerpicking style was complex and fluid, influenced by folk, jazz, and classical traditions. His voice was low, fragile, almost whispered, as if it were never meant to be raised. And his songwriting carried an emotional weight that felt far older than his years. When he entered university, that difference became more pronounced. While others socialized and experimented, Nick drifted further inward. He struggled with structure, with expectation, with the idea of fitting himself into any predefined shape. Music remained the only space where he seemed fully present. It was through a combination of chance encounters and quiet persistence that Nick found himself signed to a record label in his early 20s. On paper, it was a dream scenario. Studio time. Professional musicians. The promise of an audience. But from the beginning, there was a disconnect. Nick was not built for promotion. He disliked interviews. He resisted live performance. He found it difficult to explain his own work, let alone sell it. In the studio, he could be focused and meticulous, but outside of it, he withdrew. He rarely spoke about his ambitions. He seemed uncomfortable with the idea that his music now belonged to a marketplace. His first album arrived to polite but muted attention. Critics struggled to categorize him. Folk audiences found him too introspective. Pop audiences found him too quiet. There was Northwest obvious place for him in the musical landscape of the time. Instead of adapting, Nick retreated further. As his career continued, the gap between his artistic depth and his public reception widened. Each album was more refined, more emotionally bare, and more isolated. The arrangements grew starker. The lyrics more inward-looking. There was a sense, even then, that his music was documenting a gradual disappearance. Behind the scenes, those close to him noticed changes that were harder to ignore. Nick became increasingly distant. Conversations were brief, often strained. He struggled to maintain routines. He lost interest in things that had once grounded him. Periods of silence stretched longer and longer. What had once been shyness began to look like something heavier. The pressures of expectation, however modest they appeared from the outside, weighed heavily on him. He was aware that his music was not reaching people. He was aware that time was passing. And yet the tools required to push himself forward, self-promotion, resilience, compromise, were exactly the things he seemed least equipped to summon. As success failed to arrive, the narrative around him began to shift. He was labeled difficult, unreliable, withdrawn. But those labels missed the deeper truth. Nick Drake was struggling to exist in a world that demanded a version of himself he could not become. By the early 1970s, the signs of serious mental distress were impossible to ignore. He returned to live with his parents. Medical professionals became involved. Medication was prescribed. Attempts were made to stabilize him, to protect him, to bring him back toward something resembling balance. But the distance between Nick and the world had grown vast. His music, ironically, had never been clearer. Stripped of ornamentation, it sounded like a man speaking softly from a great distance. Songs that felt less like performances and more like observations made in solitude. Reflections on time, isolation, and the quiet fear of slipping away unnoticed. Looking back now, it is tempting to hear prophecy in those recordings. To interpret every lyric as a warning. But at the time, those around him were simply trying to help him survive. To get through days. To manage symptoms. To hold him together. What they could not see, what no one could see, was how close he already was to the edge. And as the years narrowed into months, and months into weeks, Nick Drake's world grew smaller still. Until, eventually, everything that mattered was contained within a single house, a single room, and a silence that no one fully understood. In the weeks leading up to his death, Nick Drake's life had narrowed to a fragile routine. He was living again in his parents' house, surrounded by familiarity but isolated in ways that familiarity could not fix. The rooms were quiet. The days moved slowly. Meals were taken together, conversations kept brief, gentle, careful, as if everyone sensed that too much pressure, too many questions, might cause something to break. Nick spent long hours alone in his bedroom. Sometimes he played guitar. Sometimes he did nothing at all. He slept irregularly, drifting in and out of rest without a clear sense of time. Medication had become part of his daily existence, not as a solution, but as a management tool, an attempt to keep the worst of the darkness at bay. Those around him noticed how thin he had become. How withdrawn. How little energy he seemed to have for even the smallest decisions. He was not making plans. He was not talking about the future. When asked what he wanted to do next, he often had no answer. There were no dramatic warning signs. No angry outbursts. No public cries for help. No sudden declarations of despair. And that absence, in retrospect, is one of the most dangerous elements of his final days. Because what appeared to be calm may have been resignation. Friends who encountered him during this period described a man who seemed emptied out. Polite, distant, present in body but not fully engaged in the world around him. He did not argue. He did not protest. He simply existed, quietly, passively, as if conserving energy for something no one else could see. There were small moments that, later, would take on greater weight. Nick revisiting old records. Nick sitting in silence longer than usual. Nick drifting through the house late at night, unable to sleep. But none of it registered as an emergency. The medical framework around him focused on stability. On preventing extremes. On keeping him functional enough to get through the day. What it could not address was the deeper issue, the sense that his inner life had stalled completely, that meaning itself had become unreachable. In the days immediately before his death, nothing remarkable was recorded. No final interview. No farewell message. No sudden burst of creativity. His life, by then, had become defined by absence rather than action. And that made it incredibly difficult for anyone to recognize that the end was approaching. The night before he died passed without incident. There were no raised voices. No alarms. No disturbances in the house. Nick went to bed in his childhood room, as he had many nights before. The house settled into sleep. Outside, the world continued on, unaware that one of its quietest tragedies was unfolding in real time. What makes these final days so haunting is not what happened, but what did not. No intervention. No interruption. No last-minute rescue. Just the steady continuation of a life that had grown so still, so muted, that its ending slipped through unnoticed. And when morning came, everything that had been carefully held together would finally give way to a moment that no one inside that house had been prepared for. The final 24 hours of Nick Drake's life unfolded without spectacle. There were no dramatic turning points, no visible countdown, no moment that signaled to those around him that everything was about to end. What makes those hours so difficult to reconstruct is precisely that they looked like so many days before them, quiet, restrained, almost ordinary. Nick spent that day at his parents' house. According to what is known, there were no visitors. No urgent phone calls. No sudden changes in routine. He ate, rested, and remained largely withdrawn, speaking little and keeping mostly to himself. To anyone observing from the outside, it would have appeared as another calm, uneventful day. But calm does not always mean safe. Nick had access to prescription medication used to treat his depression. The pills were legal, medically sanctioned, and intended to help him cope. There were no alarms attached to them. No supervision that suggested immediate danger. Yet those small tablets would become the center of the questions that followed. As evening approached, the house settled into its familiar rhythm. Lights were turned off. Doors were closed. Nick returned to his room, the same space where he had grown up, where he had practiced guitar, where his inner world had always felt most protected. It was not a place of escape. It was a place of retreat. Sometime during the night, Nick Drake took an excessive amount of his medication. What cannot be stated with certainty is why. There was no note. No recorded intention. No definitive evidence of planning. According to reports, the amount ingested was far beyond the prescribed dosage. Enough to overwhelm the body. Enough to stop the heart. Whether this was a tragic miscalculation, confusion, forgetfulness, a dulled sense of risk caused by depression and medication, or a deliberate act remains unresolved. What is clear is that no one heard anything. No cry. No disturbance. No sound that would have alerted the sleeping house. Nick died alone in his bed, during the night, without witnesses. By the time morning arrived, whatever struggle had occurred was already over. When his parents went to check on him, they found him unresponsive. The stillness of the room was unmistakable. Medical help was summoned, but it was immediately apparent that nothing could be done. He had been gone for hours. The official conclusion pointed to an overdose of antidepressants. Accidental or intentional, the language remained cautious. The lack of certainty left space for interpretation, and that space would never fully close. There were no final words to analyze. No last phone call to dissect. No message left behind to explain the silence. Only a young man, 26 years old, who had died quietly in a house filled with people who loved him, yet could not reach him in time. In many ways, the most devastating aspect of Nick Drake's final hours is how unremarkable they were. There was no chaos, no visible crisis. His death did not arrive with a warning siren. It slipped in gently, disguised as another night in a long sequence of quiet nights. And that is why, even decades later, his final hours remain so unsettling. Because if something this final can arrive without noise, without drama, without interruption, then it raises a haunting question that extends far beyond Nick Drake himself. How many final hours look exactly like this, until they are no longer hours at all? In the days following Nick Drake's death, there was no public investigation filled with press briefings or forensic drama. The facts, as they appeared on paper, seemed straightforward. A young man with a history of severe depression. Prescription medication. An overdose. A quiet house. A quiet end. And yet, almost immediately, uncertainty settled in. The official determination was careful, restrained. There was no definitive statement declaring suicide. There was no conclusive declaration of accident either. The language hovered in between, leaving room for interpretation, and with it, a question that would refuse to fade. Those closest to Nick were divided. Some believed, deeply and sincerely, that his death was accidental. They pointed to his fragile mental state, to the effects of medication, to the possibility of confusion or misjudgment. Depression, they argued, does not always announce itself with intent. Sometimes it dulls awareness. Sometimes it erodes caution. Sometimes it makes even simple decisions dangerously unreliable. Others were less certain. They looked at the long arc of his withdrawal. The steady narrowing of his life. The erosion of hope. They questioned whether someone who had retreated so completely could truly have been unaware of what he was doing. They wondered if the absence of a note meant ambiguity, or if it simply reflected a man who had run out of words long before that night. The lack of clarity ensured that no single narrative could take hold. Medical reports could describe what happened to his body, but not note what was happening in his mind. There were no witnesses to testify to his state of mind in those final hours. No messages left behind to anchor interpretation. Every conclusion rested on inference, and inference is fragile. As the years passed, the debate evolved alongside Nick Drake's growing posthumous reputation. When his music began to reach new listeners, people returned to his lyrics with a different intensity. Lines once heard as poetic melancholy were re-examined as potential signals. Albums recorded years earlier were treated as emotional documents, each song scrutinized for clues about his inner world. Some listeners heard resignation. Others heard longing. Still others heard neither, only beauty shaped by sadness, not a plan for self-destruction. The danger, of course, lies in retroactive meaning. Art does not always predict fate. And yet, when an artist dies young, the temptation to read backward becomes overwhelming. There were also broader questions, less personal but equally uncomfortable. Could the medical system have done more? Was the medication appropriate, or too easily accessible? Was there sufficient understanding of how fragile Nick Drake truly was? These questions had no villains, no clear failures, no satisfying resolutions. They pointed instead to a larger problem, a world that lacked the language and tools to recognize certain kinds of suffering until it was too late. Unlike cases filled with scandal or conspiracy, Nick Drake's death offered no shocking revelation to chase. Its mystery lay in its quietness. In the space between accident and intent. In the impossibility of certainty. That unresolved tension is part of why his story continues to resonate. There is no final answer to deliver. No secret document waiting to be uncovered. No confession that will suddenly make sense of everything. Only a set of facts that refuse to form a single truth. And perhaps that, too, is part of the tragedy. Because some losses do not end with closure. They linger, suspended between explanations, asking us to sit with discomfort rather than resolution. As time moved forward, Nick Drake's name began to surface again. His music found its audience at last. His influence spread quietly, deeply, across generations that never saw him alive. And with that recognition came a renewed need to understand not just how he died, but what his life, and his silence, ultimately left behind. Nick Drake did not live to see the life his music would eventually have. In the years immediately after his death, there was no sudden reevaluation, no surge of interest, no recognition that a singular voice had been lost. His albums remained largely unnoticed, drifting quietly through second-hand shops and forgotten shelves. For a time, it seemed as though his disappearance from the world would remain complete. And then, slowly, something changed. New listeners began to find his songs, not through promotion or nostalgia, but through chance. A track heard late at night. A voice that felt inexplicably familiar. Music that did not demand attention but rewarded patience. As his work resurfaced, it carried with it a strange emotional weight, as if it had been waiting for the right moment, and the right audience, to be understood. Nick Drake became, posthumously, what he had never been in life, essential. His influence spread quietly, but deeply. Artists cited him as a foundational presence. His music appeared in films, television, and private moments of reflection. Listeners described the uncanny sensation of feeling seen by someone who had been gone for decades. His songs did not age. They seemed to exist outside of time, untouched by trends or context. And yet, that delayed recognition carries a heavy irony. Everything Nick Drake was eventually praised for, his restraint, his vulnerability, his refusal to perform emotional spectacle, were the very qualities that made it difficult for him to survive in his own time. The world learned to value his voice only after it no longer had to take responsibility for the person behind it. Seen through the lens of his final hours, his life tells a different story than the one usually attached to artistic genius. This is not a tale of self-destruction fueled by excess. Not a cautionary myth about fame gone wrong. Not a dramatic implosion played out in public. It is the story of a man who faded quietly, whose suffering was easy to overlook precisely because it was so contained. A reminder that danger does not always announce itself with chaos, sometimes it arrives wrapped in calm, in politeness, in silence. Nick Drake did not leave answers behind. He did not explain himself. He did not offer closure. What he left instead was a body of work that continues to speak for him, gently, honestly, without urgency. Music that does not ask to be understood all at once. Music that waits. And perhaps that is the final lesson of his story. That some people do not break loudly. They do not demand rescue. They simply grow quieter, until the world mistakes that quiet for peace. Nick Drake's final hours remind us that attention matters. Presence matters. And that listening, truly listening, is sometimes the only intervention that can make a difference. Because in the end, the tragedy is not just that Nick Drake died young. It is that he was finally heard, only after he was gone.